point is well made there. Let's have one from the front.
That would be my reply as well, maybe.
Everybody's had his say. You're having your say in full front there. That's all.
Joking.
The lady at the front.
Thanks, David.
Could you speak up so they can hear
I
that?
was just interested to hear a little bit more about what Ian said, just because it's easy for us to draw the wrong conclusions from the data correlations that you've presented. So you said there's been a decrease of reports of ASB by 380, and at least 10 to 12 houses have been released back into the market. Are you saying that because of the selective licensing, somehow the bad landlords have given up their properties? And I don't want to draw the wrong conclusions, which is why I'm trying to understand this. And are you saying that because of the licensing in Little Ilford, for some reason perhaps the good landlords have taken over and therefore reduced the number of ASB? If not, then what is really happening there?
Right.
Because it's really easy to draw the wrong conclusions from just looking at the macro data.
Indeed, and I won't oversimplify it. I mean, you know, it's quite a complex issue. What we've got, well, first of all, we've had an increase in the private rented sector. When I was trying to address that gentleman's concern that we've driven landlords out, and the opposite happened. Actually, we got an increase in the private renting, so that didn't happen. I think the second issue is clearly the area is made up of private rented, about 50% of private rented, but there's also a significant number of owner occupiers and other tenants. Now, across the board, we've had a reduction in rubbish dumping. Now, it's not only the private rented sector that's happened, but Sir Robin's point is true. If your next door neighbour shoves their bed out of the garden, then you're sort of tempted to do that as well. So what we were trying to do was trying to change behaviours by not only using landlord licensing, but it's part of a bigger picture in what we were trying to do in terms of influencing behaviours. And that's behaviours for all the residents and the businesses. We weren't just looking at landlords, we were looking at the businesses that, those of you know Romford Road, there's a number of businesses that trade along there, and people live above the shops, and there's another problem there. So we were actually doing an inclusive piece of work. Now, it's not entirely exhaustive, and we're only 19 or 20 months in, but we've got enough evidence to show, and also the problem that we know is getting worse, that I think we've managed to convince Sir Robin and the other members that this is the way that Newham has to go if we're going to deliver our vision, because otherwise all the statistics are moving in the other direction for us in some aspects.
I understand what you're saying. I think what's not clear to me is how the fee has actually led to a change of behaviours with the right group of people. Whether it's changing the mix of the competition of the landlords, or whether it's actually a deterrent to people to act in
it's not the fee. What we want is responsibility. I think, and that's from the tenants and the landlords. What we'd like to see is, I think, the landlords take responsibility for managing the properties. We hope that the tenants take responsibility for acting in tenant-like behaviour. We're just trying to increase behaviours across it. Now, the fee is almost incidental to what we're trying to achieve here. I think it's really thrusting towards management. That's what we're missing. And you can see it in street after street where properties are not being visited. The tenants don't know who the managing agents are. We've got some very good examples, and we have some really dire examples. Very cool. So we're trying to get management through this licensing system. Now, it's not a perfect thing, but it's the only tool we have at the moment to do what we're trying to do.
Richard, right?
Yes, I just wanted to make a point that Little Ilford is a very small area, and there was a huge concentration of council resources in that area. Of course it was going to improve. I don't really see why licensing landlords was necessary really as part of that improvement. I think it would have improved anyway with that level of council involvement and resources that were put into that small area over that period. And with the existing enforcement powers that the local authority has, I think they could have resolved those problems without having to license the landlords.
Okay, gentleman there.
Little Ilford, is that a typical example of the success of your scheme? You never answered this lady's question. Little Ilford has some very bad properties for years. It's had a makeover, a big makeover of new buildings. You've never mentioned that. That has to have had some input. You've had new people coming in. They've got new places, they've got a private. I don't know who owns those places. I would suggest that Little Ilford is not typical. success to your scheme. That no matter how much money we put into this scheme, we are not responsible for the fact that you don't police the street. Within 5 minutes walk of the Newham Town Hall, you can go to a number of places, shops, and you can see the other industry that we know nothing about, the adverts in the shops. You know, there's 2 industries here. We know nothing about those stats. Those photographs are alien to these people here. Your figures here, when were they done for the ASBOs?
Last 2 years.
Last 2 years. And what defines an antisocial behaviour? The council define it, or is it a police conviction?
It's a very wide definition, but it takes in criminal and general environmental crime.
Well, we're not impressed by your proposals, I must admit. I think everyone is not impressed. Because it suits the stats. You've had a big makeover in at Milford, and you believe the idea that your scheme is what's changed the figures. You don't believe it.
Right, let's be clear, it wasn't the whole build-up of water, it was a small part of it, and actually, I think I'm right saying it wasn't the one that had new building in it, was it? Because that was the other part of Landlords. So that was the other end. So no, it was the north of the Landlords, which hadn't had any new building for quite a while. Secondly, I'm sorry, we took the stats, we looked at the stats, and we unanimously went, this is brilliant. This is going to be the answer to the problems our residents are facing. One of my difficulties is, we have resident feedback. We have residents telling us what the problem is. Now I believe there's got to be a completely comprehensive approach. We've tried the approach before without putting everything together, and this is part of the comprehensive approach. And tackling the problem of bad landlords, if we do not do that, we will not solve the problem and the increasing problem of behaviours in our borough that are unacceptable. Now, when we saw the figures, when we looked at it, and we tested several things out, and there were some things we weren't sure of, some things we weren't convinced about, but in the end, we were clear that this would leave us with a place that now needs a lot less policing. See, my view is you go in an area, you don't want to spend the resources continuing to police. You want people to be behaving in a different way. We are convinced, and we're satisfied with the figures we got, that looked very persuasive. Sufficiently so that we're going to look to spend money and effort and time running it out across the rest of the borough. But I promise you, if you're a resident of Newham, you'll be sitting here saying, it's a real big problem, you know. Private rents are a real big problem. And in the end, we are answerable to our residents and have to do something about it.
Let's have some question from the back. I can see a gentleman there. Could you speak up? Speak up, please.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm a chartered surveyor, and I also a private landlord, and I know Ian Dick very well. And I go around on behalf of banks, and I see huge amounts of HMOs, 3-storey HMOs, not nice. You can't even cope with trying to get those licenses. So if you try to overstretch yourself and create a huge bureaucratic, absolute nightmare, all 150 quid we're going to be paying you is just going to create loads more offices so that you can get people to fill in forms. And I think it's very disingenuous for you to say that...
That means lying, by the way.
Well,
what disingenuous means lying. Just so it's clear, right?
You say the cost is £150 or £500 per landlord. That's not the actual cost, because you're going to give us forms about 35 pages to fill. You're going to ask us to provide plans of accommodation. All these things cost. And so I don't think it's fair for you to say it's only going to cost that. It's going to cost much more money. I think you've got a major problem in Newham. I think you're going the wrong way about it. You should first of all concentrate on the licensing of 3-storey properties, which are the most dangerous properties first. And then once you get that sorted out, maybe we should look elsewhere. But I don't think you're going the right way about it.
Yeah, I'll just come back with just a direct answer if I can. First of all, the HMO licensing question. In Europe, there are 193 HMOs that are licensed. You're quite correct. It's made no difference whatsoever in this borough. When the Housing Act was a bill in Parliament, I went up to Parliament to talk to the Select Committee and said, what you're proposing will not help our part of East London because it excludes most of our properties, which is 2 stories, and also because of the requirement for the numbers of people in the property, you know, some landlords, let's face it, will pretend that people aren't tenants, that they're not living there, that they're friends. So we're forever chasing them. It's a piece of legislation that's actually full of holes. And if you go to Camden, they've got about 100 more than we have. Think how many three-storey properties they've got. So in that respect, the HMO licensing is a rather a red herring for us to achieve what we want. If we could have done it through that, I think we would have done it. And that would have been far easier, but we haven't been able to do it. And on the issue about the forms and the bureaucracy, we realise again, just repeating again, we realise we don't want to make this a bureaucratic exercise. And part of the consultation is we want to hear from you how we can make this as simple as possible, because we know the landlords that apply are not the ones that we are interested in. We know from Middle Ilford that they are not the landlords that we're interested in, all the landlords that don't apply, where we can actually concentrate our resources. So we've got no interest in gathering vast amounts of data. We will have to get some information, but we don't want that.
But you answer your own question, because it's only about 3% of all HMOs should be licensed, that's you've got a record of. So if you just put it to the whole of the area, then you know it's only going to be a small percentage which is going to be licensed.
Not under this, because we know in Little Ilford how it works. Once we made it very clear that every landlord had to have a licence, it was very clear to the landlord community that that's what we were doing, and it was very clear about the conditions we're imposing. The HMO licensing system as nationally applies is quite frankly a bit of a disaster. It doesn't really work.
Well, doesn't this rather, if I may come in here, beg the question that if mandatory licence of these more dangerous, allegedly dangerous HMOs is patently not working in Newham, what makes you think that selective licensing will work in Newham? It doesn't seem that it works.
Because it has. We're satisfied in Little Ilford that it worked. Everybody has to be licensed. We would have used HMO powers if we could. Of course we would have. We'd use any powers we could have used. We'd use powers that are simple and as cheap as possible. I have no interest in getting you to fill in forms. Everything, no, it's not what I want. I want to clean the borough up. That's what I want.
But it was a tiny area, and it's a tiny
Of course it's a tiny area, but we did it as a pilot. We did it as a pilot. We said we're doing it as a pilot. We took 260 private rent and sector properties, and we've seen a big improvement. And we're comfortable with taking that, the other things we're doing, and the other much tougher planning rated enforcement we're doing, and we're spending a lot of money. And I also recognise at a time of great difficulty, the borough will commit more resources to it, which is why I'm saying I'm not so bothered about the money, and I want to find ways of making it simple, but the borough will commit resources to it, because it is the biggest single thing we face. I did a question time the other day with a number of landlords there, and I have to say that when you take the people who lived in the borough, there was enormous frustration at the state of private renting, and everybody that was at that meeting saw it. Now it happens at every meeting I do. There is enormous frustration, and one of my points would be again, if we don't do something that fixes this and does it in the best way we can with you to minimise your I want to do that, then at some point something else is going to come down the line. Because it will not be tolerated by people, those conditions I showed you. That's where shelter started from. You want to see the campaign these guys did in the 60s and the 70s, private rented? I want to solve that before they ever have to get active.
But you already have the enforcement powers to deal with it.
We don't believe that.
How would licensing have prevented those properties from getting into that state?
We don't believe that. We think that with this, that enables us to tackle the bad landlords and fix some of the problems. But that's where the bulk of our ESP is coming. Guys, I'm not sitting here telling you this because it's what we get. It's what we get every day.
We've got a number of people waiting to ask questions. Do you have a point?